In this video, I'll present some of my work that's part of my PhD research on the language of school EFL textbooks. This presentation was first held at the IVEX Symposium Corpus Linguistics and the Classroom in Dortmund in March 2019. And in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the verb make and how it's used in school EFL textbooks. So why choose make? Well, first of all, because it's a high-frequency verb, and at the same time, it's often considered to be an easy verb. Easy perhaps because it's short, it's certainly not regular, and easy in the sense that it's learnt early on. However, we know that the verb make is not an easy verb. It's highly polysemic, and it includes mainly delexical and idiomatic uses, which are very difficult for English learners. Depending on the student's mother tongue, but certainly with German, French or Spanish, there is a high potential for negative L1 interference. So German native speakers will often make experiences or make their homework, and idiomatic collocations in English. And indeed, many studies have shown that make is used in unidiomatic or non-native-like ways by learners of English as a foreign language. The question I'm wondering is some of this unusual non-native-like usage of the verb make input-induced? In other words, could it be the language input that students receive in the classroom that encourages them to either not know how to use make in a native or idiomatic way, or even mislead them into thinking that make is used in other contexts? And to check this hypothesis out, I'm looking at the language of school EFL textbooks, and that's because textbooks make up a large quantity of the L2 inputs that students obtain. We know that textbooks are often not just the book that's used on a daily basis in the English classroom, but it often forms the basis of the syllabus that is taught. But let's look at what a modern textbook looks like. School textbooks don't have just one register. They will feature things like dialogues, and indeed textbooks will also have audio and video materials with spoken interactions. Textbooks will also include informative text. Here we have an extract from a website. Lots of instructional language and explanations, as well as words and sentences out of context, often in the form of exercises. Then there are things that are called personal communication, which are things like personal letters, emails and diary entries. Some narrative text here, some fiction, songs, poetry and rhyme. And then in some textbooks, particularly the beginner textbooks, we'll find sections written in the L1. So here in a German textbook, green line, we have an explanation that's in German with just a few example sentences in English. So my study is corpus-based, and for this I'm drawing on a textbook corpus which I've compiled and which consists of 9 textbook series from 3 different countries. So for example, for Germany, I have 3 textbook series, each consisting of 5 textbooks. I now have the new green line number 5, so this could be updated. And these are from 2 different publishers. Here for France, I have another 3 textbook series, and textbooks used in Spain are actually textbooks published by British or American publishers, but used in Spain. And what I've done is I've manually annotated those textbooks for the different textbook registers that I identified earlier on. So that means that I scanned the textbooks or obtained them as PDFs to start off with directly from the publishers, or bought digital versions of the textbooks, and then used an OCR program to extract the raw text from these textbooks, and then manually annotated this raw text for textbook registers. So that means I can identify which text in, say, green line 1 are conversations, dialogues, or which ones are fictional narrative text, and so on and so forth. This enables me to compare individual textbook registers with a reference corpus of a similar target readership and communicative purpose. So that means I can compare the dialogues in the textbooks to transcripts of genuine conversations that have taken place in the UK in the form of the Spoken BNC 2014. For the narrative, the fiction text, I've compiled a corpus of youth fiction. These are 300 books which are targeted at teenagers and young adults, and I've drawn samples from these books. This is what forms the reference corpus for youth fiction. I also have a reference corpus of informative websites for teens. So these are things like online encyclopedias or news pages, magazines, especially targeted at teenagers, and I've extracted text from these websites and compiled a reference corpus for the informative text in the textbook corpus. As a result, I can compare textbook language as a whole or individual textbook registers to individual reference corpora or the reference corpus as a whole. So there are lots of levels of comparison that are possible, including between the different textbook series and between the different countries of use, as well as between the different levels of each textbook. So let's look at how frequent make is in these various textbook registers. It's very common in instructional language. It's less frequent or least frequent in narrative and conversations and the dialogues in the textbook. And these are actually the two textbook registers that I'm going to focus on in this presentation. The narrative, the fiction in the textbooks, and the conversations and dialogues featured in the textbooks. If we compare the relative frequency of make in the textbook fiction as compared to the reference youth fiction corpus, we find that make is less frequent than we would expect. And similarly, textbook dialogues feature fewer occurrences of make than we would expect as compared to the reference BNC Spoken 2014 corpus. So let's look at some of these differences in more detail. To do so, I've extracted all instances of make. So this is the lemma make, so that it includes all the forms of the verb in the narrative and the spoken textbook subcorpora. So that means I've ended up with 392 occurrences in the textbook fiction and 674 occurrences in the textbook conversation. And I randomly extracted the same number of make concordance lines from the two reference corpora, the youth fiction here and the spoken BNC 2014. And each of these concordance lines was manually annotated for meaning. So what does the make refer to? For the main collocate lexeme and lemma, and we'll see what that refers to in a minute, and for the semantic field of the collocate, which are partly automated, but I still had to manually check all of these semantic fields. So let's start with the meaning, and we can see that there are various categories. The first one, the most common, is make in the sense of produce, in the sense of I want to make a carrot cake. The second category is what I refer to as delexical produce. And this is a trickier category, but it's about performing an action, something like to make a mistake. Often delexical verbs could be replaced by another verb. Things like to make an argument, you could say to argue. And in that sense, make is delexical because it carries less meaning than the collocate argument. The third category is make in the sense of to earn money. So I've made enough money to buy them a house. The third category is to achieve, in the sense of I've made it. Then there is a sense of be or become. I think women make better poets than men. We have a causative make in the sense of they don't make me wear things that I don't like. Make in the sense of ensure. This is mostly with the collocates sure and certain. So to make sure or to make certain that something happens. And then there are a number of idiomatic phrases. And finally, the last category are phrasal verbs that follow. And all of the examples here are from textbooks from my textbook corpus. This graph shows you the distribution of make meanings in the textbook conversation and in the spoken BNC 2014. So you can see, for instance, that the spoken BNC has a lot more instances of make in the causative sense than textbook conversation. We can also see that there are more instances of make in a delexical sense in the textbook conversation than in the spoken BNC. And finally, we find that there are more idiomatic occurrences of make in textbook conversation than in the spoken BNC, but this is actually largely due to just one phrase. Finally, phrasal verbs with make are considerably less frequent in textbook conversation than they are in the spoken BNC. If we compare now the textbook fiction with the reference youth fiction corpus, we find that there's the opposite phenomenon for the delexical makes. So actually we have significantly fewer delexical make in textbook fiction than we would expect when we look at our reference youth fiction. But we have the same pattern as we had earlier on with phrasal verbs. So we have significantly fewer phrasal verbs in the textbook fiction than we would expect. Finally, achieve, in the sense of I've made it, is more frequent in textbook narrative. Now let's look at the collocates of delexical occurrences of make. The spoken BNC has many instances of to make sense, make a difference, or make a decision. So the larger the font, the more frequent these collocations were. And if we compare this blue word cloud, which represents the collocates in the spoken BNC, with the red one, which represents textbook conversation, we see that to make a difference is also fairly large, as well as to make a decision, which is not as large but still a frequent collocate. But we also find that the largest or the most frequent collocate is to make a mistake. These are the collocates of delexical make in youth fiction as compared to textbook fiction, and again we find that to make mistakes is something that textbooks love to speak about, even in the conversations and in the fictional text. So this is not about the instructions or the explanations. It's interesting to look at delexical make because it's been shown to be something that's particularly problematic for learners of English. So here we have the results of a study on learner corpora. We have here text produced by Swedish learners of English, text produced by French learners of English, and this is a reference corpus of text produced by English native speakers. And what we can see is the percentage of delexical makes, which include what they refer to here as speech collocates. So these are things like to make a decision, make a mistake, make a choice, an argument, a claim, and so on and so forth. And we find that for Swedish learners, 13% of delexical make are speech collocates. For French speakers, it's 9%, but for native English speakers, it's 30% of delexical make. What's interesting is that a number of these collocates that we find in this list, these are the common ones in the native speaker data. The ones in bold were not at all found in the learner corpora. What I find in the textbook is that some of these collocations are not found at all in the textbooks either. So perhaps it's no surprise that the students are not using them. They haven't been exposed to them either. These are the proportions of speech collocates of delexical make, fairly similar proportion in the fiction corpora. But if we look at the conversation here, we find that the spoken BNC has many more of those than the textbook conversation. And some of the ones that we don't find in the textbook data are listed here, and some of these were noted as particularly frequent in native speaker writing and infrequent in learner writing. There are major differences between textbook conversation and spoken BNC sample in terms of idiomatic phrases involving the verb make. Essentially, we have one very, very frequent one, which is make friends, which is very popular in textbooks and less popular in general English, but this will be due to the kinds of people who speak in the BNC. These are mostly adults, as opposed to the speakers in textbook conversations that are often children and teenagers. And here are some of the most frequent idiomatic phrases that come up in conversations. Now, phrasal verbs is a particularly interesting one. In the textbook subcorpora that I'm looking at here, so textbook fiction and textbook conversation, we find these 7 phrasal verbs. They occur very, very infrequently, sometimes just once across the entire textbook corpus. If we compare that to what we actually see, we find that there are very frequent phrasal verbs which are not featured at all. Now, if we turn to the semantics of make collocates in the sense of produce, so this is like things like to make a carrot cake, we find that in textbook conversation, that's in red, we have a lot of these collocations that refer to sports and entertainment. For example, to make a film, to make a video. And far fewer in the spoken BNC. However, the spoken BNC is full of food collocates and quite a few drinks collocates too. So things like to make a cake, to make a cup of tea. Some of the other differences below are much smaller and in fact not statistically significant. So let's have a look at some of these main collocates. The spoken BNC, as I said, is full of food and drinks, that's in blue and green rather, and in purple. So make food, soup, cake, bread, cheese, sandwich, and so on and so forth. And the textbook conversation actually has its strongest collocate film, and also we find video, movies as fairly high up the list. We also have some food collocates like to make breakfast, make a sandwich or cake. On the whole, we have a range of other types of collocates, as you can see here. Now let's turn to make in the sense of cause. You may be aware that this is something that's taught, particularly in the French textbooks, I have to say, but also in the textbooks used in Germany and in Spain. In this other textbook, we have 3 causative verbs that are introduced to the learners: make, have, and let. When we use make in the causative sense, we can use that in a number of different constructions. So the first one here, we made it impossible, so that would be with an adjective, with a noun, to make our city a better place, but also with verbs, and that in different patterns. The first pattern, and the most frequent, would be I want to make people understand, so now we have an infinitive here. And another option would be to have a to infinitive, I'm being made to do everything. And all of these examples, again, are from textbooks in my textbook corpus. So what I've done is I've decided to look at make in these kinds of constructions, the ones here with the verbs, in more detail in the textbooks. For this analysis, I've actually extracted all of these make constructions with a non-finite verb complement that are found across the entire textbook English corpus. And so these 289 make constructions are extracted from these different textbook subcorpora. And then I manually coded each construction for its type, for the verb lemma as well, that's included in the verb complement part. So that means I've included everything from the textbook corpus except the words and phrases, because these are sentences that are used mostly out of context in exercises. So these are the basic results. We find that out of those, the vast majority are of this particular construction type, so that was with the infinitive, and we have very few of these 2 other types here. Now, my results can be compared to Gilquin's study on learner corpora. So she's compared English native speakers, English as second language learners, and English as foreign language learners. And she's looked at, in their essay writing, the kind of make constructions, the kind of causative constructions, I should say, they use. So not only make, which are here, but also have, get, and causative constructions. And we find that native speakers do use this construction in writing, and it is the most frequent causative construction they do use, but it's used far less than by English as a foreign language learners. So actually the results that we see here match rather well what I found in my textbooks. It would imply perhaps that the textbook language has an influence on the kind of writing that students produce afterwards. The next step in this analysis was to look at the verbs that are used in these make constructions. So it's I made her do something. So that do, this particular slot, can be filled by lots of different verbs. And I've looked at the most typical ones in the textbook corpus. What I find is that the verb that's most strongly associated with this make causative construction is feel in the textbooks. And after that we have laugh, sound, think, promise, wonder and seem. So that's in the order of attraction. And we also have some verbs that are not at all associated with this construction. On the contrary, they are repulsed by this construction, and that's the verb to be and to do, which have a negative collocational strengths here. So I can compare my results to those from Gilquin, who did a very similar analysis, looking at the verbs that are in this make construction. She compared English as a native language with English as a second language and English as a foreign language. Among the native-like collocations, we find seem and appear, which were also very high in the textbook registers. On the side of the non-native distinctive collocations, we actually find be and become, which is no surprise because this would be considered unidiomatic or incorrect. These are constructions like she made me be happy, where we would not use the be, we would simply use an adjective construction and say she made me happy. And same thing with the become. So here it's no surprise that the non-native speakers tend to overuse these verbs as opposed to the native speakers. Another interesting finding here is the verb feel, which is considerably overused by English as a foreign language users as compared to English native speakers. And you might remember that feel was one of the highest collocates for this particular construction in the textbook registers. Here were the top results from the textbooks. So we find feel very strongly attracted to this construction, as well as seem and appear, which are less attracted but still more attracted than many other verbs. And then the repulsion side we had be and become. So here's just a quick overview of my exploration of the use of make in EFL textbooks. I've shown that we can compare the results from a textbook corpus analysis with the results from reference corpora, often based on native speaker language, as well as to the results of learner corpus analysis. And all of these types of corpora can inform us in improving language teaching materials. For this particular study, I've shown that make is used in different semantic fields in the produced sense in the textbook language as compared to the reference corpora. In terms of its delexical usage, textbooks have a strong emphasis on making mistakes, and perhaps at this stage we should also focus on making an effort or making a difference, perhaps have less of an emphasis on mistakes and errors. And I also showed that delexical make collocations that refer to speech or communication actions are underrepresented in school textbooks, and these are also underused by learners of English, as has been shown by past studies. In terms of the idiomatic uses of make in textbooks, these are dominated by making friends and making fun of someone. So there are a few other idiomatic uses of make in the textbooks. And I've put a question mark behind this bullet point, but we do seem to observe an overrepresentation of the make plus infinitive causative construction. And we certainly see a very frequent use of make someone or something feel as a construction, which again was a construction that was shown to be overused by English as a foreign language learners. These are some of my references, and if you have any questions, comments or suggestions, they're very welcome. You can contact me via email or find me on Twitter.